It's Thursday, August 29th, 2024, and we are 67 days away from the election. Welcome to today's Make It Make Sense mini episode. I'm Grant Herms. Today on the show, we are talking about Kamala Harris's very first sit-down interview since becoming the Democratic candidate. And this is going to be a mini. There's not a ton to talk about right now, mostly because Harris hasn't talked yet. That interview is happening tonight at 9 o'clock. Harris and Tim Walz are doing a joint interview with Dana Bash on CNN. Tonight marks a full 38 days since Harris became the candidate to get to her actual first interview or really answer anything more than just fleeting questions from reporters as she was boarding Air Force Two. Now, in this race and how fast things have moved in the last 6 weeks, it does seem kind of odd that she hasn't sat down for a real interview yet. Now, I've talked about this before. I did in the Make It Make Sense episode called Campaigning Everywhere and Nowhere, and I talked about it with Chris Cillizza, who said this about not having an interview yet.
I think it is important, generally speaking, for someone who is running for president of the United States, who has a very ill-defined platform, and by the way, Donald Trump is very much included in this, to answer or at least be asked questions from, I don't want to say adversarial sources, but sources that are not friendly. So not Fox and Friends for Donald Trump, right? Not Elon Musk. I think that is an important tester of how a candidate thinks on their feet, what a candidate actually believes, how they handle adversity. Do I think it has to be like a sit down with Kristen Welker on Meet the Press? No, I don't. But like, I don't think it's just box checking, and I don't think it's just gatekeeping. Like, I think there is actual real value in both testing yourself in that space and affirming the role that a free and independent media plays. Now,
Okay, so before we get into more of that and what we expect to hear tonight, after this interview was announced, there was a lot of immediate chatter about why Harris wouldn't do this interview alone. And I'll admit that I was one of those people in conversations right away, but the more I thought about it and the more that I looked at it, it's not uncommon. Frankly, it's wildly common for the first interview after the convention to be a joint interview with both the top and the under on the tickets. Obama and Biden did it. Romney and Ryan did it. Trump and Pence did it. Trump and Vance did it the Monday after the Republican National Convention. So if you hear that argument that she should be doing this on her own, just know that there's not a lot of election historical context to back that up. That being said, this election isn't something that we actually have any historical context for. We've never seen anything like this, so we should see Harris do another interview of some kind as we get closer to the election, likely after the debate. Okay, so why hasn't Harris sat down for an interview yet? There might be a few reasons for that. The first one is there just hasn't been a lot of time. Like I said before, this campaign, even though it doesn't feel like it, is really just only 6 weeks old, and she hasn't even been the official nominee for a full month yet. So while we'd been accustomed to this light speed campaign here the last few weeks, that's not how campaigns work. The Harris campaign is still and was still trying to cobble together an introduction to the country for her and for Tim Walz. And second, that cobbling together of this campaign took priority over an interview. Harris needed to spend the first few weeks of her candidacy convincing the Democratic base that she was up for the job. And maybe not convincing so much as needing to spend time in important swing states and in front of key groups of voters so that they could see that she was the person who was worthy of having the baton passed to her. And third, and this is the most common thing that you'll hear, I mean, I've mentioned it before on the podcast too, that Harris just didn't need to do a long-form interview or really any interview for that matter. She has raised record amounts of money. Her campaign has seemed to be endlessly memeable and popular online, and in a good way, not a J.D. Vance way. She's been getting a ton of free unearned media is what they call that, basically just because this campaign is so wild that the press is going to cover her no matter what, so her message is going to get out there no matter what. And the DNC was a wild success for her candidacy and for Democrats. her candidacy has injected more life into this party than most people thought was possible just a few months ago. So really, the Harris campaign is probably thinking, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Why jeopardize all this momentum just to appease the establishment press or to quiet Republicans who have been talking about this frequently since she became the candidate? They just didn't see a need for it. There's also this other piece to it, too, is that there might be some worries about her skills being interviewed. She hasn't always been good against an interviewer who's not a friendly one or that might not have a totally friendly audience. I mean, her last true sit-down was back in May with MSNBC. And then there was the one that everyone talks about, which was the one from 3 years ago on NBC with Lester Holt, where she did a terrible job of explaining what her position meant to find the root causes of immigration for the Biden administration as they work to solve crises at the border. She just did not do a good job of explaining what her role was, and then by extension, what the Biden administration was planning to do at the border. It was really seen as a disaster of an interview, and the administration kept her off the airwaves for quite some time after that. But all of that is behind us. The introductory period, the campaign needing time to roll out, the idea that maybe she doesn't need this thing. She is the actual nominee now. We're past the convention and her acceptance speech as an introduction of somebody who might be presidential. And the campaign has chosen CNN to go with this interview, which I think is an interesting choice too. Just a little bit. The Harris campaign could have decided to play this incredibly safe and gone to, say, MSNBC and chosen a friendly but maybe tougher interviewer. I mean, after all, Trump and Vance went on Fox News and were interviewed by Jesse Waters, so it was an extremely friendly interview. For those of you who don't know who Jesse Waters is, he took over for Tucker Carlson and is staunchly a Trump supporter and, uses words like "we" for Republicans, which you don't really hear most journalists say. Technically, his show doesn't actually air during what Fox considers to be actual news. It's an opinion show, but he still got the interview nonetheless. On the other hand of this, Dana Bash from CNN, who will be doing the interview tonight, is a tough interviewer and is willing to hold people across from her to give her real answers. And I'm sure that there will be some pleasantries probably at the very beginning, like how did Harris land on Walz? So that one might have some serious implications for it, but also what it's been like to be a part of this crazy campaign together. Does Harris like tater tot hot dish? Which, let's be honest, everyone likes tater tot hot dish. It's a Minnesota delicacy. But we should also expect some much tougher policy questions too, especially from Bash. And that'll be things like what the Harris-Walz administration would do when it comes to the economy or immigration, and how do those things differ from the Biden administration, and certainly how they differ from the Trump plans that have been put out there for the Trump campaign. Also, expect to hear some things that maybe they haven't talked a bunch about before, like things like tax policy or the housing policy or child tax credits, those things that she said on the campaign trail but hasn't said directly into a camera during an interview yet. Likely, there might be some questions about Harris's 2020 run for president as well. What she thinks went wrong in 2020, what she's learned since then, and why she thinks Americans as a whole should vote for her now when Democrats didn't want her at the top of the ticket then. You should also expect to hear a lot about foreign policy, especially the war in Gaza. That has been a sticking point for a lot of liberals who were reluctant to say yes to voting for Joe Biden if they were going to vote for him at all. And just today, the group Muslim Women for Harris said it was disbanding because they didn't want to be a part of a group that was going to get behind a candidate who didn't allow a pro-Palestinian speaker on the stage across the 4 nights of the DNC. Now, I talked a little bit about this in the Make It Make Sense Substack. It's under the heading Locked Out of the DNC, and it's all about the uncommitted movement staging a protest for 4 days during the DNC because they wanted a pro-Palestinian speaker on stage. I really talked about it being what could be a big problem for Democrats in key swing states, but you can head there to the Substack to check that full article out. All I'm saying here is that Harris will need to answer some questions about that and where she stands on that to, yes, talk to Democrats, but also talk to Americans as a whole. Now, she did mention it in her speech. It was one of the moments in that acceptance speech, and it practically begs to be asked about. And one of the other things to be on the lookout for is her answers on attacks from Trump, and not just the attacks on her personally. She'll likely just wave those off as Trump being Trump, as she has in other instances, but his attacks against the strength of elections and the health of American democracy. Trump has been out in full force recently, priming Republicans like he did in 2020, saying that Democrats are cheating, that the election is being interfered with or rigged, or if he loses, it will have been stolen somehow. Harris will need to answer questions about her views on American democracy and how she would respond to attempts to undermine the election, no matter what the outcome will be. Really, the thing to look forward to, and it's also what Chris Cillizza said, look for how Harris handles being put on this spot in a situation where she's not necessarily in control, how she handles the adversity of having her feet held to the fire, and how she juggles tone and temper in those moments. Now, I also hear and understand and empathize with the criticism that no one in American politics or the American press is doing that to Trump. The bar for him is much lower, and broadly, the press nor American voters expect Donald Trump to meet the moment in the way that I was just talking about Harris meeting those moments. The standards are just different for Harris, which is both unfair, but it's not untrue either. And speaking of untrue, after the interview tonight, I'm planning on doing a fact check of it. That'll be up on the Make It Make Sense Substack as well. So you can subscribe to get that. It's just $5 a month, and you'll have access to that and all sorts of other bonus content and articles. And because I have pitched the Substack to you twice now, I think that's where we call this. That is it for today's MIMS Mini. Thank you so much for listening. Please rate and review the podcast on whatever app you're listening to it on. It really helps put the show in front of more people. You can also like and subscribe to the YouTube page, and you can share the show on social media at MIMS Newspod. That's MIMS Newspod. It's all one word on every platform. Thank you again for listening today. I'm Grant Herms, and I will talk to you tomorrow in the full episode of Make It Make Sense.